pen was still in my hand when my sister-in-law started crying, and I want to be clear that they were happy tears. She had her phone out, already typing something, and my brother was rubbing her back in slow circles like she'd just delivered good news at a hospital. We were standing in the parking lot of the law office in Bracebridge, the gravel half frozen under our boots, the kind of late March afternoon where the snow has gone gray and tired but won't quite leave. My brother said something about taking everyone to the old station for dinner, his treat, and my sister-in-law laughed and said she'd been craving their fish and chips for weeks. They were going to celebrate. They had every reason to think there was something to celebrate because 20 minutes earlier I had signed away my half of our mother's cottage, every page, in front of the lawyer they had chosen. Then her phone rang while it was still in her hand, and she answered it on speaker without thinking, the way you do when you're expecting a friend. And a man's voice came through so loud that I heard every word from where I stood 8 feet away. Tell me she hasn't signed yet. Do not let her sign anything. There's a problem with the release. I'm looking at it right now. Call me the second you get this. My sister-in-law's face did something I'd never seen it do. The smile didn't fall so much as freeze, holding its shape after the thing holding it up had gone. My brother went very still, and I stood there in the parking lot with my breath clouding in front of me, and I did not say a single word, because by then there was nothing left to say. The thing I had spent 2 weeks building was already finished. It had been finished for about 11 minutes. I should go back because none of this makes sense unless you understand the 14 months that came before that parking lot, and unless you understand what kind of person I am, which is a person who reads numbers for a living and has a hard time turning that part of my brain off even when I desperately want to. My mother started forgetting things in the autumn of the year before last. Small things first, the way it always starts. She'd call me to ask when I was coming up to the cottage and then call again an hour later to ask the same question. And I told myself it was just age, that she was 71 and lived alone and didn't have enough people to talk to. Then it was the stove left on. Then it was the afternoon she drove into Huntsville for groceries and a neighbor found her in the independent parking lot at 9 at night, the car running, the trunk full of melted ice cream, because she couldn't remember which direction the cottage was. The diagnosis came in January. Early onset wasn't the term, she was past that, but the doctor in Toronto used the word aggressive. And I remember thinking that was a strange word for something that takes everything away so quietly. I work as a forensic accountant. What that means, when people ask at parties and then immediately regret asking, is that I get hired to find the lie inside a set of books. Insurance companies bring me in when a claim smells wrong. Law firms bring me in during divorces when one spouse swears the business is worthless and the other knows better. I spend my days inside spreadsheets that someone built specifically to fool a casual reader, and my whole job is to not be a casual reader. I notice when a number that should be round isn't, and when a number that shouldn't be round is. I notice when a date doesn't line up with the filing it claims to support. It is tedious, unglamorous work, and I am very, very good at it, and I am telling you this now because it matters later. When the diagnosis came, I did the thing I think a lot of us do without ever deciding to do it. I just started showing up. I was 31, renting a place in Hamilton, single, no kids, the most movable person in the family by a wide margin. So I moved my work to remote, told my firm I'd be operating out of Muskoka for a while, and I went up to the cottage to take care of my mother. I figured it would be a few months. It was 14. A cottage is not a house. I learned that fast. Our place on Lake Vernon was beautiful in July and a death trap in February, and I spent that first winter learning how to bleed the pipes and split wood and shovel a roof so the weight of the snow wouldn't cave it in. I learned the names of the home care workers who came 3 times a week, and then I learned them again every few months when the agency rotated staff. I learned how to talk to my mother on the days she knew exactly who I was, and how to talk to her on the days she thought I was her own sister, dead 20 years, and how to talk to her on the worst days when she was frightened of me, this strange woman in her kitchen. and would back into a corner with her hands up. I won't pretend I was a saint about it. There were nights I sat in the car in the driveway after she'd finally fallen asleep and cried until I couldn't breathe, and there were mornings I resented her so much I scared myself, but I stayed. My brother did not stay. My brother is 4 years older than me and lives in Ottawa, where he works in something adjacent to government contracting that he has never once successfully explained to me. He came up maybe one weekend a month. He'd arrive on Saturday afternoon with a box of pastries from a bakery he liked, sit with our mother for 2 hours, take a lot of photos with her for reasons I understood later, and leave Sunday morning citing a meeting. His wife came less often. When she did come, her contribution was to walk through the cottage with a kind of appraising slowness, opening cupboards, looking at the dock, asking me whether I thought the property had gone up much. I want to be fair to them, because I've had time to think about this, and bitterness is boring. My brother loved our mother in his way. He just loved her the way you love a season that's ending, from a distance with a lot of nostalgia and very little labor. The labor was mine, and the money was mine too. Because here's the part that grinds, even now. Home care in Ontario is covered to a point, but the point is low, and the gap between what the province pays and what a dying woman actually needs is filled by somebody's credit card. It was filled by mine. Private support workers for the overnight shifts when I couldn't physically stay awake anymore. The stair lift. The hospital bed. The mileage. By the end of it, I had close to $40,000 on 2 cards and a line of credit, and I never once asked my brother to split it, because somewhere in those 14 months, I'd stopped expecting anything from him, and the not expecting had calcified into a kind of pride. My mother died on a Wednesday in February, almost exactly a year after the diagnosis, in the cottage, with me holding her hand and a home care worker named Grace standing in the doorway crying. It was peaceful, as these things go. I'd promised her she wouldn't have to go to a facility, and I kept that promise. And that's the one thing from this whole story I will let myself feel uncomplicatedly good about. The other thing started at the reception. We held it at the cottage because that's what she would have wanted, and because by then the cottage was the only thing left that mattered. My mother's estate was not large. There were some modest savings, an RRSP that had taken a beating, a life insurance policy that mostly evaporated against the final medical bills. The cottage was the estate. It was the thing. 3 bedrooms, 100 feet of shoreline on Lake Vernon, the dock my grandfather built, the kitchen where I'd learned to make my mother's terrible Christmas tourtière. It had been in the family since the 60s, when you could buy lakefront in Muskoka for the price of a used car, and now it was worth, conservatively, north of $1 million, because that's what Muskoka has become. My brother cornered me in the kitchen while people were still eating squares off paper plates in the other room. He had a folder. I remember registering the folder before I registered anything he said, because a folder at a funeral is a strange thing to bring, and some part of my brain that never fully turns off filed it away. He said he needed to talk to me about the cottage, that it was complicated, that he hadn't wanted to burden me while I was dealing with everything, but it couldn't wait. The story he told me over the following 10 days went like this. Our mother, in her last few years, had remortgaged the cottage. There was a second mortgage, he said, that she'd taken out to cover expenses that she'd been ashamed of and hidden from both of us. On top of that, the cottage had been reassessed and the property taxes had ballooned and there were arrears. And on top of that, because the cottage wasn't her principal residence anymore once she'd been deemed to be receiving care, there was going to be a capital gains problem when it transferred a deemed disposition, a number with a lot of zeros that the estate would owe the CRA. He laid all of this out with printouts, assessment documents, a mortgage statement, a CRA notice. He told me that if I accepted my half of the cottage, I'd be accepting my half of all of that, and that I should understand he was trying to protect me. He and his wife had spoken to a lawyer. They were prepared, he said, to take the cottage entirely into their names and absorb the whole burden, the mortgage and the arrears and the tax hit, so that I could walk away clean. All I'd have to do was sign a release of my interest in the property. He said this to me in the kitchen where I'd nursed our mother for 14 months, and I remember nodding along, and I remember a part of me, the exhausted part, the part that just wanted it all to stop, thinking, thank God, let him have it. I don't have the energy for a cottage anyway. But there's another part of me, and that part had been quietly reading the folder. The thing about people who lie with documents is that they almost always lie to a casual reader. They build the lie for the person who'll glance and nod. They don't build it for the person who pulls the actual land registry because they assume you won't. Because most people don't know you can or how. I know how. I do it before breakfast. The first thing I noticed was the mortgage statement. It was for a lender I'd never heard of, which is fine. Plenty of lenders exist. But the statement listed an origination date in a month when I knew, with total certainty, that my mother had not left the cottage, because I'd been there every day of that month and there was no notary, no signing appointment that I hadn't driven her to or arranged. My mother could not have independently arranged a mortgage during a period when she sometimes couldn't remember how to use a fork, and the signature on the statement, when I looked at it under the kitchen lamp, was a printed image, not a wet signature, which a real mortgage statement would never include. The second thing was the property assessment. I pulled the actual MPAC assessment, which anyone can request, and the assessed value on the real document was different from the value on his printout by about $300,000, in the direction that made the tax math look scarier than it was. The third thing was the CRA notice, which I'm fairly sure he'd built in a word processor because real CRA correspondence has a specific format and a specific reference structure, and his did not. It had the logo, it did not have the bones. I brought the whole folder to my friend Renee, who I trust more than almost anyone, and who used to work in title insurance before she had her kids and got out of the business. We sat at her kitchen table in Hamilton with the documents spread out between us and a pot of coffee going cold, and she went through them with me, and within an hour she'd found 2 more things I'd missed. The deemed disposition logic was wrong, she said, because a cottage that's been a family secondary property forever doesn't suddenly trigger the kind of hit he was describing. And even where there is a capital gains question, you don't handle it by having one sibling sign away their interest. You handle it through the estate, none of it held together. It wasn't a financial crisis. It was a stage set. It had the architecture of a thing built to be looked at quickly and believed. I sat in my car outside Renee's place for a long time after that. I think people expect that the moment you realize your only sibling is trying to defraud you out of $500,000, you feel rage. I didn't. What I felt was something colder and quieter and much worse, which was clarity. I understood, sitting in that car, that he had been planning this since before our mother died. The photos. The visits timed to look good later. The folder ready at the reception. He'd been building a case for a story, while I'd been building a medication schedule on a whiteboard. And the thing that actually broke something in me, the thing I keep coming back to, was that he'd counted on my exhaustion. He'd looked at his little sister, who'd just spent 14 months watching their mother disappear, who hadn't slept properly in a year, who had 40 grand in debt and no fight left, and he'd thought, she'll just sign. He knew me well enough to know I was tired. He didn't know me well enough to know what I do for a living? That's not exactly true. He knew what I did. He just never thought of it as a thing that could happen to him. I want to tell you that I went straight to a lawyer, that I did the responsible, boring thing, and I almost did. But here's what stopped me. A fabricated document is a problem you can fight, eventually, expensively, over years, with experts arguing about whether my mother had capacity, and it would have been my word about her condition, against his word about her condition. And he had photos of her smiling with him on good days, and I had nothing but my own testimony about the bad ones. Fraud on paper is slippery. People wriggle out of it. What I needed was not the documents. What I needed was for him to say it, out loud, to me, in words that couldn't be reinterpreted later by a good lawyer. So I bought a recorder. I want to be honest that this is the part of the story where I stopped being a victim and started being something else. And I've made my peace with that. but I won't pretend the line is clean. In Ontario, you're allowed to record a conversation you're a part of. One-party consent. I checked, twice, because I'm me and I check things twice. Then I bought a small digital recorder at a place on Barton Street. Cash, and I drove home and tested it 3 times in my apartment, talking to myself like a lunatic, playing it back, making sure it picked up a voice across a room and not just my own. Then I called my brother and told him I was leaning towards signing, that he'd been right, that I was overwhelmed and I just wanted it over. But that I wanted the 3 of us, him and his wife and me, to have one dinner first. A nice one. A goodbye to our mother, I said. He agreed before I'd finished the sentence. People who think they've already won are generous with their time. We met at a place in Bracebridge, a steakhouse with high-backed booths and the kind of acoustic deadness that I had specifically scouted on a previous afternoon under the pretense of having a coffee. I got there early. I set the recorder in the inside pocket of my bag and put the bag on the bench beside me, and I ordered a glass of wine I didn't intend to drink. I'll spare you most of the dinner. I led him gently. I asked the questions a tired, defeated woman would ask. The ones that sound like surrender. I asked what would happen if I decided to keep my half after all and just dealt with the CRA myself. And this is the part I'd been counting on because I knew my brother and I knew that the thing he could not tolerate was the idea of not getting what he'd planned for. He got loud. Not screaming, but low and hard, leaning across the table, and he told me that if I tried to wreck this, he'd sue me for every dollar he'd spent on our mother's care, which was 0, but he named a figure, a fictional $60,000, and he said it with total conviction. His wife jumped in to back him up, naming things she'd supposedly paid for, the overnight workers, the stair lift, all the things I had actually paid for, claiming them as their own out loud in a quiet restaurant. And then my brother said the sentence I'd come for. He said, "You sign the release or I will make sure you never see a cent, and I will bury you in legal fees until you can't afford a bus ticket." He said it the way you say something you've never had to be careful about saying. I let him finish. I told him he was right, that I was sorry, that I'd sign. The relief on his face was something I'll remember for a long time, and not fondly. We even split a dessert. 2 days later, we were at the lawyer's office in Bracebridge, a lawyer his wife had found, a man named Mr. Tessier, who I'm fairly sure had no idea what he was sitting in the middle of. My sister-in-law had positioned herself right next to his desk. My brother stood near the door, not blocking it exactly, but near it. The release was printed and waiting with a pen laid across it. I asked Mr. Tessier, with a small practiced tremor, whether by declining to sign I'd be personally responsible for the cottage's debts, and before he could answer, my brother answered for him, repeating the whole fabricated structure out loud, the mortgage, the arrears, the tax hit, the protection he was so generously offering. Every invented detail in a room where a recorder and my bag on the chair beside me was capturing all of it cleanly. Then I picked up the pen and I signed every page. What none of them knew, what I'd found in the one place my brother hadn't thought to look, was in our mother's actual will. Not the version of events he'd constructed, but the document itself, which I'd obtained a certified copy of through the estate because I'm the kind of person who obtains certified copies. My mother had made her will years earlier, before she got sick, with an old family lawyer in Huntsville, a careful woman named Ms. Beaudry who'd known my mother for 30 years, and Ms. Beaudry, being careful, had included a clause, a no-contest clause with teeth. The language said that any beneficiary who attempted to obtain another beneficiary's share through fraud, misrepresentation, duress, or coercion would forfeit their own entire interest in the estate. It's the kind of clause that gets written and then sits in a drawer for a decade doing nothing. The legal equivalent of a fire extinguisher. I had 4 minutes alone in the hallway outside Mr. Tessier's office while my brother and his wife were shaking the lawyer's hand and being warm and victorious. 4 minutes. I used them to email the audio file and a brief written summary to Ms. Minnis. Baudry, who was the named estate trustee's lawyer, and to send a copy to the lawyer my brother had hired, Mr. Tessier himself, whose email was right there on the release. I attached the land registry. I attached the real impact assessment. I attached everything, and I hit send, and then I put my phone in my pocket and walked out into the parking lot where my sister-in-law was already planning fish and chips. Her phone rang while it was still in her hand. I told you how that part went. The frozen smile. My brother going still. What I didn't tell you is that I felt almost nothing watching it, which surprised me. I'd expected a rush. I'd built the whole thing for that moment, and when it came I just felt tired, the same tired I'd felt for 14 months, like something I'd been carrying could finally be set down, but my arms didn't yet believe it. I got in my car. My brother was still standing in the gravel with his wife when I pulled out, and he looked at me through the windshield, and I held his eyes for a second, and then I drove back to Hamilton. The estate took a while to sort out, the way these things do. Ms. Bolte? Baudry was thorough and unhurried, and, I think, quietly furious in the way that careful people get furious. The release I'd signed was set aside on the grounds that it had been obtained through documented coercion, which the recording made impossible to argue, and then the no contest clause did exactly what it had been written to do. My brother's interest in the estate was forfeited entirely. Not reduced, forfeited. The clause didn't care that he was family. It cared what he'd done. The cottage came to me. All of it. The dock my grandfather built, the kitchen, the 100 feet of shoreline, the whole improbable, ridiculous, beloved thing. There was no second mortgage, of course, because there had never been one. There were no real arrears. The tax situation, handled properly through the estate, was a fraction of the monster he'd invented, and the estate covered it. I used part of what remained to pay off the $40,000 of debt I'd put on my own cards, keeping our mother comfortable, and I want to tell you that paying that off felt like victory, but mostly it just felt like the end of a long subtraction. Mr. Jello. Tessier, for his part, was apparently mortified, and Ms. Baudry made a referral to the Law Society about the circumstances under which the release had been prepared, though I never followed how that resolved, and I find I don't much care. I blocked my brother's number. I blocked his wife's. I deleted them out of my phone entirely, the contacts, the old photos, the whole archive, and I won't pretend that didn't cost me something, because for 31 years he was my brother. And there's a version of him in my memory. A kid teaching me to skate on the lake, that I genuinely loved and now have to keep in a separate drawer from the man in the restaurant. Both of them are real. I haven't figured out how to hold that yet. I went to the cottage in May, once the lake had opened up. I sat on the dock my grandfather built, and I drank a coffee, and I watched the loons come back, and I thought about my mother, and I cried a little, and it was the good kind of crying. The kind that's mostly missing someone rather than managing them. I saw a counselor a few times that spring, and she said something I keep coming back to, that grief and relief aren't enemies, that you can mourn a person and be glad you no longer have to defend yourself against the people who orbited them. I've found that to be true. There's a version of this where I don't buy the recorder, where I'm too exhausted to fight, where the tired part of me wins, where I sign the release at that funeral reception just to make the folder go away, and the lie holds, and my brother gets the cottage, and I spend the rest of my life telling myself a story about a second mortgage that never existed. I think about that version more than the one that actually happened. I keep it close on purpose. Because the frightening thing isn't that he tried it. The frightening thing is how close it came to working, and the only reason it didn't is that I happen to do for a living the exact thing required to see it. So, I'll leave you with the question I can't put down, and I mean it honestly, not as a tidy ending. If the people who are supposed to stand between you and the worst of the world turn out to be the ones building the trap, how long would it take you to notice? And once you noticed, sitting in a cold car outside a friend's house with the truth in your lap, how far would you actually be willing to go? The cottage was never really about a cottage. I understood that the morning I sat on my grandfather's dock with cold coffee and watched the loons come back and felt the whole 14 months settle in my chest like silt going still. What my brother did didn't come out of nowhere. It grew slowly in the gap between the person who shows up and the person who watches someone else show up. He came once a month with pastries and took photos. I changed the whiteboard every morning. That difference compounded, the way debt does, until one of us believed the labor had earned him a cottage and the other one was too tired to argue. Effects have causes. He built a folder full of lies because somewhere along the way he decided that loving our mother from a distance was the same as carrying her, and a person who believes that will eventually need someone else to be the villain. Here's the thing I keep turning over. I didn't win because I was angry. Anger would have had me screaming at the funeral reception and signing nothing and getting nowhere. I won because I did the boring, patient thing. I pulled the land registry. I called Renee. I checked the law twice. I bought a recorder and tested it 3 times like the careful, unglamorous person I am. The skill that saved me wasn't cleverness in the moment. It was years of learning to not be a casual reader and then having the steadiness to use it when my hands were shaking. Knowing how to read a fake mortgage statement is worth nothing if you fold the second a brother raises his voice across a steakhouse table. And underneath all of it, the part I'm proudest of and least sure how to talk about is that I stayed honest about who I was being. I recorded him, yes, and there's a coldness to that I've made peace with, but won't pretend is pretty. What I would not do was become him. I didn't fabricate. I didn't bend a single number. I let the truth I already had do the work, because the truth, properly documented, is heavier than any lie someone builds to be glanced at. If you take anything from this, take that those 3 things have to travel together. Brains without a spine just makes you a person who sees the trap clearly and walks into it anyway. A spine without a conscience makes you the brother. And a conscience without the patience to act on it just makes you a tired, good person who gets signed out of her own mother's house. You need all 3, and you usually find out whether you have them on the worst day of your life, in a cold car outside a friend's place, with the truth sitting in your lap, deciding what you're actually willing to do about it.